Hello, everybody. I think we're going to get started now. Just to say welcome, everybody, and I hope you're enjoying COP26 so far. This is our Cambridge Zero Nature and Biodiversity Research Symposium. We've got quite a few speakers today. We've got Adam Pellegrini, Emily Lines, Coline Jaworski, Andrew Bladon, Alejandro Guizar Coutiño, and Rogelio Luque Lora. And they're going to be talking about various aspects of nature and biodiversity. Just a few housekeeping notes from me. I'm Lata Sahonta. I'm the manager of the Energy Interdisciplinary Research Centre here at Cambridge, and we work with Cambridge Zero. Just to let you know, members of the audience, please do keep your microphone muted, and it's quite nice sometimes for the speakers to have some faces to look at, so do keep your camera switched on if you like. Please, you're invited to submit questions into the Zoom chat, and then I'll field those questions and I'll ask them to the speakers. Or if you've got some questions that turn up during the question and answer sessions, you're very welcome to raise your hand virtually, and then you can ask your question directly. If we run out of time, then the speakers can always type some answers into the chat to answer your questions. And speakers, if you do have your own questions then or points of interest, then please use the chat function as a way to communicate that to the audience as well. So yeah, the chat can be quite versatile. Just to let you know that the session is being recorded and it will be available on YouTube afterwards. And also, this is one in a series of research symposia that have been going on during Michaelmas Term. So next week we've got a symposium on AI and sustainability, and the week after we've got a symposium on hard to abate technologies and sectors, and then in December we've got a symposium specially dedicated to working globally as well. So if you're interested to attend those, or if you're an early career researcher and you want to give a talk at one of those, you think it fits well with your research interests, then please do let us know. You can register for all of those symposia at the Cambridge Zero web pages, and you can also apply to take part as well. There's a list of lots of different COP26 activities, and also I think there are some previously recorded events that have passed as well that you can have a look at on the Cambridge Zero pages, and do sign up to the Cambridge Zero mailing list so you can keep up to date with all the different activities going on. Okay, and with that I'm going to hand you over to our first speaker, who is Dr. Adam Pellegrini, who leads the sorry, now I've lost my notes. who leads the Disturbance Ecology and Ecosystem Function Group in Plant Sciences, and the topic of Adam's talk is fire as a fundamental ecological process and mitigation pathway. So Adam, I'll give it to you.
All right, fantastic. So thanks for the invitation to talk today. I'm going to be presenting on my group's work on how fire affects ecosystems, and then present some new exciting ideas about how fire management can be used to promote carbon storage in ecosystems. So often when we think about disturbances in ecosystems, we think about them in a very bad light, right? They can release carbon, they can, kill species and exclude some from the environment. But it's also really important to remember that disturbances are an intrinsic process and natural in many ecosystems, and they've actually been used to understand the evolution of species strategies and ecosystem assembly. And I really like this quote by Eugene Odum in his paper on the strategy of ecosystem development published in the 60s, where he effectively says that understanding how an ecosystem recovers from a disturbance, either natural or anthropogenic, is really critical to understanding how the world will respond under man's present environmental crisis. And obviously, the environmental crisis component has only become more severe since he wrote this in the 1960s. And as a consequence of that, there's been a lot of really interesting conceptual work digging into how the response of ecosystems from disturbances may differ because climate change is shifting the disturbance regimes. And just to give a plug for disturbances, they come in all different shapes and sizes, and they manifest across a number of different attributes of the ecosystem and processes within the system. So at the organismal level, I'm going to be focusing on fire, and we can think about a combusting organism biomass, but this is determined by the functional traits. It impacts the population sizes by determining demographic rates like mortality and recruitment. It shifts the community composition by changing the competitive landscape or resource acquisition. And then, of course, all of these factors integrate to the ecosystem scale by determining the fluxes of carbon and nutrients and the subsequent storage of carbon and nutrients in that landscape. And I'm going to be talking about fire as this fundamental ecological process. And the reason why it's important to think about it that way is because organisms and ecosystems, the majority of them on the globe, can experience fire naturally. And I've just given some pictures here. We don't think about fire very much in the UK, but this is an example of a burn in the Lizard Peninsula, a coastal heathland in Cornwall. And then, of course, you have fires in coniferous forests, like in the Western US, and in savannas. So it's one way to think about how fire affects ecosystems and is a fundamental ecological process is to look at the evolution. And what I'm showing you here is a phylogeny of 570 woody plant species. And the important thing to take away is that these bars here show a value for a fire tolerance trait, in this case, investment in bark. And whether or not the bar is red or black tells you whether or not the species is adapted to fire or not adapted to fire based on like habitat preference analyses. And what you can see is that there's been the evolution of fire adaptedness across a number of different plant families, and it's not at all phylogenetically conserved. And so clearly plant species have been evolving to cope with fire for hundreds of millions of years. And it's also affecting their distribution in present day. This graph here shows you the proportion of burned area of a species distribution, so fire frequency, and then its investment in bark. So there's this clear signal on species traits. But fire is also important for determining fluxes of carbon and nutrients at the global scale. And often these are evaluated using dynamic global vegetation models. So this exact same models that are used to forecast climate change and to get an idea for just the absolute magnitude of the effect of fire. We can do scenarios like what happens to primary productivity when we change fire frequency. And the key take home here is that there's a large amount of variability in the sensitivity of primary productivity to a doubling of frequency of fire that's currently happening in that given ecosystem. But of course, humans are changing fire. And this is a bit of a complex figure, so I'll walk you through it. So the color is telling you the fire counts observed via satellites across the globe. And then these circles are telling you whether or not something, a characteristic of fire, is either increasing, so that's red, decreasing, blue, or both increasing and decreasing, which is purple. And the important takeaway here is that in some areas you have increases in burned area, fire frequency, fire severity, that's the boreal coniferous forests, like really that take the cover of the Guardian when they're aflame. But then you also have areas where fire frequencies are declining, often in savannas because humans are excluding it. And the important component here is that fire is not just this common thing that's changing in one direction across the globe. It's varying in all these different ways in different ecosystems. So how do ecologists try to understand this? Well, The really ambitious ones set up these large experimental manipulations of fire where they segment the landscape. So these are plots anywhere from 1 hectare to over 10 hectares in size, and they apply fire to those plots. They burn them at different frequencies to look at how shifts in fire frequency affect an ecosystem. They also burn them in different seasons to manipulate fire intensity. So what has this told us about the ecosystem? Well, we actually know quite a bit, and this is just a broad brush overview of some of the things that we've learned. So the first thing is when we look in one particular ecosystem, a savanna, when you generally lower the fire frequency, tree cover can increase and it can become a forest. And this is catalyzed through changes in the growth of species, the composition of those species, and their traits. We also know it impacts soils, and it does so by not necessarily combusting those soils, but shifting the composition and biomass of plants and how that is entered into the soil. And then it can structure feedbacks between plants and soils. So these are just a few characteristics of the ecosystem that can be modified by fire. But we have all these experiments that are going on at this site. What level can they allow us to generalize? Because when you look at different fire regimes and different ecosystems, there's a lot of variability. And so can we put together all these different experiments and try to understand broad generalizations? And that's one thing that my group has been doing over the past few years is we've been organizing a network of fire manipulation experiments. And so these are manipulating fire for several decades. So anywhere from 10 to 70 years. So really getting an idea for the long-term change in ecosystems. We've got pretty good coverage across biomes, all things considered, when you're talking about this level of an ecosystem manipulation. And then it's got a large distribution across geographies with some clear gaps, right? We still have a long way to go. But one thing that we're interested in is understanding how fire changes the carbon in soils. So it's relatively easy to calculate the amount of carbon changes above ground, but because we can estimate it from satellites, our models tend to be better for estimating carbon in plants, but with soils, we're still very limited. And so some of the work that our syntheses have developed has been trying to map the changes in potential carbon storage in soils due to altered fire. And so this is just an example from a result of a current project where we've looked at the trends in fire frequency across the entire globe. We've identified where fires have either been increasing or decreasing. We've applied statistical models from those site-level experiments and estimated how much carbon may be changing. And what we found is that the burned area in drylands, where it's been declining, it's created a carbon sink on the order of 88 teragrams of carbon per year. And to put this number in perspective, this is about as much as boreal forest soils sequester carbon each year. And often when we think about soil carbon fluxes at the global scale, boreal forest soils rise to the occasion. And what we have found recently is that the sustained declines in fire in savannas is resulting in this large and, I would say, unexpected carbon sink. But we can then take a step back and say, all right, how well do our modeling tools actually capture these changes? Because this is a substantial flux that has implications for changes in carbon in the atmosphere. And to do that, we can run simulations of dynamic global vegetation models, altering the fire frequencies, and ask these models, okay, how much carbon are you going, or is a model predicted to change in the soil? And this is a part of the fire model intercomparison project that I'm just a collaborator in. But when we compared the model simulations with our data, we found some pretty concerning disconnects. And the y-axis here is showing you the difference between the model, the dynamic global vegetation model, and then what our empirical statistical model predicts. Anything above this dashed line shows that the model underestimated it. Anything above it, it overestimated it. And what you can see is that in very dry areas, so this is the aridity index, where lower values mean more arid, and the models are underestimating the potential change in soil. And we see a similar thing in high precipitation seasonality environments. And the reason why this is important is because fire, the majority of global burned area is in these dry lands. Savanna grasslands account for 70% of global burned area. So we have to ask ourselves, if our models don't do a good job at predicting the effect of fire in areas where fire is the most common and important, how well can we really rely on these models to estimate carbon fluxes at the global scale? But that's something that we're working on trying to improve. Now, from this, you may have a takeaway of, great, we'll suppress fires, we'll store a bunch of carbon, it's an important flux. But what we've found, and a number of other scientists have found, is that when you suppress fire, you tend to exclude species that are endemic and adapted to the fire-prone environment. So this is from the Brazilian Cerrado, a biodiversity hotspot, where a gradient of plot carbon because of fire suppression tends to be linked with an increase in species, but this is a result of the colonization of forest species and loss of savanna species. So some work that we are now doing is we're proposing that rather than excluding fire, you can use fire as a nature-based climate solution, because fire changes all these different processes in soil organic matter, not just the total amount, but the actual physical chemical properties that we know are important for decomposition. And we've done some surveys in a number of different ecosystems. These are just from temperate coniferous forests. And the important takeaway here is that all of these arrows are different variables that are measuring some degree of decomposition and loss of soil organic matter. And so in the unburned plots, you have the highest potential losses due to things like changes in decomposition activity. And this is because burning is changing the properties of that soil organic matter and making it more resistant to decay and decomposition over time. Now, we've been working with some modelers and soil scientists to try to identify what are the key factors by which fire changes soil organic matter and how are they implemented in models. And you are probably looking at this figure right now saying, oh my God, I have no idea what is going on here. But the important thing is that soil organic matter's stability is determined by, can microbes access it? Is it relatively easy to break down? And is the right microbe there? And the fact is that all of those key components, fire can change it so that it's actually less available for decomposition. And so we need to harness that. And I am just about out of time, but I am just starting some work in the United Kingdom, and I'm happy to talk about the implications for UK ecosystems. We've been doing some stuff up in the peatlands and the highlands.
Thanks very much. That was a really illuminating talk, Adam. It sounds counterintuitive to me. So everybody, please do put questions for Adam into the chat, or you're very welcome to raise your hand virtually and ask a question directly. I've got a question from Eric. This says, you've mainly spoken about managed fires, but what will be the impact of unmanaged fires and wildfires, which are projected to increase in frequency and severity as a result of climate change?
Yep, that's an excellent question. So it's important that wildfires in forests, you're right, they are important. They account for around 18% of global burned area and carbon emissions. The main way to use fire to mitigate carbon losses due to wildfire is via prescribed burns. And so it's less feasible to do in very inaccessible areas like the Northwest Territories in North America or in Siberia, but it is relatively feasible to do over large areas like in Scandinavia and in the Western US. So there, the primary way that we can use fire to reduce carbon emissions is by reducing future fire severity. Does that make sense? Okay, and that's what a lot of the focus on fire for nature-based climate solutions has been on this fire severity question, not on the soils angle. Great question.
Okay, fantastic.
Thanks,
I've
Adam.
got a quick question. Well, maybe it's not a quick question. What is the public reaction to the suggestion that fire management is good for carbon sequestering and better ecosystems? Sorry, better for ecosystems than actually preventing fires. It sounds counterintuitive. So how does it get turned into forestry policy, or is it already happening, but just we don't know about it in the UK?
Yeah, it's the latter, but at the same time, people do know about it. I was just up in Scotland and talking to the Forestry Service, and they all clearly understand the benefits of fire, right? But there's, from the top down, there's a communication that fire is bad. But I'll take a step back. In the United States, there's obviously been a huge transformation from suppressing fire, which was the dogma in the 1970s, to using fire to manage our ecosystems. Fire has always been recognized as important in any sort of savanna grassland area. You know, I'm talking Africa, the grasslands in South America, and then also eucalypt savannas in Australia. So it's a very interesting sociological question as well about how human perception of fire changes through time. So I think a lot of it is on science communication and identifying the context where fire is an intrinsic part of a particular ecosystem. You know, slash and burn fires are a completely different story, but it can be used for the good of the ecosystem and can't be considered as this ubiquitously bad thing. I'm happy to talk more about that. That is a very long question.
Okay, great. And we have a comment here from Helen Schneider, and she says that in the New Forest National Park in the UK, we use fire management. So didn't know that this practice was happening in the UK. So that's really interesting to know.
Yeah, and I don't want to give a blanket statement about fire not being perceived as good in the UK. There's a lot of prescribed burning in the coastal heathland in Cornwall as well, but it's clearly there's this different dialogue in different countries and circles about whether or not fire is good or bad.
Okay, great. We've got a question from Andrew. Can you say anything about the importance of, or the need for, unburned areas during fire management as refuges for sensitive species, for example?
Yeah, so that is a great point. And when there was a lot of work being done of fire at the landscape scale in thinking about fire as a shifting mosaic, where basically, depending on the area of the landscape that you're in, you have a different time since fire. And the idea is that if you use prescribed burning, you can create a landscape that has a diversity of time since fires and allows for a diversity of species that may be adapted to those time since fires. And some of that will be unburned areas. And so that's often along like riparian zones in savannas or in these peatlands as you go down slope and the water table is very high. But yes, it can be very important for maintaining the more fire sensitive species.
So our first early career speaker is Coline Jaworski, doing postdoctoral research in the agroecology group with Lynn Dix. And Coline is a member of the UKRI funded H3 project, Healthy Soil, Healthy Food and Healthy People. And her talk title is Exploring the Wider Environmental Benefits of Regenerative Agriculture. So Coline, go for it.
Thank you. Can you hear me well? I suppose so.
So today I'm not going to show you any results because I've jumped on this project only a couple months ago, and data collection is actually starting only next week. But I thought I would give you an overview of the research we propose within the H3, which stands for Healthy Soil, Healthy Food, Healthy People. And I'm working more specifically on the work package 3 about regenerative agriculture, or RegenAg. Regenerative agriculture is a farmer-led transformation of farming systems. So farmers have come up with ways or practices that they can activate to restore soils and restore soil health, which had been heavily degraded from years and decades of intensive farming. So it is summarized through 5 main principles, including keep the soil covered and maintain living roots all year round, reduce soil disturbance, including tillage and inputs, integrate livestock, and maximize crop diversity. There are 2 main aspects in our work package. The first one is about ecology. We are interested in understanding what are the wider environmental benefits of regenerative agriculture. And more specifically, we are working on soil health, that is soil structure, soil biodiversity, nutrient availability for crops, and water retention. We also are working on insect diversity, and especially supported ecosystem services such as pest control and pollination. And finally, working on winter farmland birds, which populations have been declining a lot due to intensive farming, and so regenerative agriculture has the potential to reverse these trends. This research will be based on a full-year experiment in real farms. And we also are working on developing life cycle analysis on carbon emissions and other environmental impacts of that transition from conventional to regenerative farming, and also on the economics of such transition. The second aspect is about social science and will be based on farmers' interviews. So we are interested in understanding what does RegenAg means in their local context, how they adapt that concept to what they can do in their territory, and what are the challenges to the uptake of RegenAg, and finally, how can monitoring support this transformation from conventional to regen? So that can be monitoring of soil, obviously, but also of other farm-related aspects. So we are working with 2 farmer clusters. The first one on the left, the Allenford cluster, is south of Salisbury, and is representing mostly mixed farming systems. So that is both the production of livestock and cereal cropping, while the West Cambridgeshire hundreds, right to Cambridge, is more extended. So these 2 maps are roughly to scale, and is mostly cereal cropping. So in these 2 clusters, we have asked farmers to propose a 60-hectare block of land. So these are represented in colors on this map. Blocks that are farmed either conventionally or according to regenerative principles, or in which they will implement changes over the full years. Changes in the farming practices, moving away from conventional towards regen. So that gives up about 12 blocks per cluster, 4 in each of those 3 treatments. And we have a working group composed of both scientists and farmer cluster leaders and farmer cluster coordinators. And this group has worked on translating the 5 principles of RegenAg into farming practices that can be actually activated on these clusters to implement changes. So among those practices, we've come up with using more cover crops and spring cropping, retain crop residues in the field, reduce tillage, and also introduce livestock, use animal manure, introduce herbal layers in the rotations, and increase the length and diversity of rotations. We initially proposed to work to implement a BASI design. So BASI stands for before-after control impact. So you measure your response variable before implementing a change and after implementing the change. So in our case, the change could be the changes in farming practices. And if we are working on diversity, for instance, we expect regen practices to improve biodiversity. Now we also have the control blocks, conventional in our case, in which no change in practice is implemented. So we expect the response variable to not vary through time. In our design, we also have positive control, which would be the regen blocks. And here too, we don't expect changes in practices, so we don't expect changes in the response variable. So that's the ideal picture, and we've been moving away from that ideal design, and we now have a fuzzier picture which relates to the reality of farm-based experiments. So we have sort of lost our baseline because in the change groups, some farmers have already implemented some changes in the practices or are about to, while we were expecting them to start that only next year after the baseline year. Also, the control blocks are no longer perfect controls because now conventional farming in the UK has already incorporated some of the regen farming practices, such as direct drilling for oilseed rape or retain crop residues in the field. At the other extreme of the gradient, regen blocks are not perfect either because farmers are limited with their own farming context and can't necessarily apply all the farming practices that we would hope for. So we have a reduced gradient from control to regen, and we have a fuzzier timeline, and both the change and the regen groups are expected to somehow change through times because farmers are constantly adapting their practices to context and environment and weather, for instance. But that's okay, we're still going to work with that. I just want to go deeper into one example. So how do we define our specific questions and test our questions from those wider environmental benefits? So for instance, we are interested in understanding how do regenerative farming practices affect the diversity and abundance of pests' natural enemies. So why work on natural enemies? Because they are a proxy for pest control ecosystem services. We can expect that the more abundant and the more diverse the community of natural enemies, the most efficient, the most resilient the pest control services. We also expect regenerative agriculture to enhance those communities of natural enemies, first through reduced soil disturbance and reduced use of pesticides, which have been found to negatively affect natural enemies. I've put in a question mark here for pesticides because this is unclear from the field if farmers are going to be reducing pesticide use. They're not necessarily ready for that. So we'll see how it goes. Regen agriculture can also enhance natural enemies by improving their habitat through constant soil cover in the fields and increased plant diversity, which is expected to increase the diversity of natural enemies and arthropods in general. A little bit of methodology here. So how would we test that in the field? So in those 12 blocks in each cluster, we would select 1 meter width field. And in this field, select 5 random locations. In each location, put in some pitfall traps to catch active ground-dwelling predators, put in some pan traps for flying natural enemies, and possibly also do some hand netting for foliar predators. So we would have like punctual images of how does the community of natural enemies look like through space and between our control and regen groups, and also through time, and we can see how that varies. So hopefully that gave you a very rough overview of what we expect to achieve in that H3 Wet Package 3 project, whose PIs are Dr. Lindex in Cambridge and Dr. Anna Kwiatkowska in Sheffield. So we've got a very large supporting team, including expertise in soil ecology, social sciences, and life cycle analysis in Sheffield, and also a collaboration with the Game and Wildlife Conservation Trust, who are bringing in their expertise in ecology, agronomy, farm-based research, and who are actually going to lead their data collection starting next week. And we also have a group of stakeholders, including the HDB, who are going to bring in their expertise on the farm bench tool for economics of regen farming. IDES and soil associations and co-op are also involved. That's all about that I wanted to say, but thank you very much for listening, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Coline. Brilliant talk. So we've got time for questions. I've got one question while we wait for a couple more to appear in the chat. Are farmers needing to change their practices more often due to climate change in the past few years? And does this affect yield? I guess there are many different aspects to changing yield with increase in biodiversity, but also once you have increasing biodiversity, does that result in them having to do further processing before they take the plants or crops to market?
So about the first bit related to climate change, it's quite difficult to have a big picture on that, because they adapt their practices and what they actually do or crop from year to year based on climatic conditions. So obviously there are some climate change temporal trends in there, so which is changing the farming into a single direction, but that's a bit difficult to assess. However, changing towards more regen and changing towards increased resilience for climate change might actually go hand in hand, and we are also interested in testing that. So hopefully we might have a PhD starting on that next year. Yeah, because for instance, one aspect of regen farming is switching to spring crops instead of winter crops, and that helps having the soil covered and build up soil organic matter content, because you can have cover crops in between just before the spring crop is sown. And so at the same time you reduce the risk of diseases developing on cereals. So the thing is, those disease risk, it can be increased by climate change with milder winters that and hence aphid migrations, high disease risk. And then so if you move into spring crops, you can reduce that risk, basically. That comes from climate change. So there's little bits of climate change relations in our projects.
Okay, thank you. There's a question from Eric. How did you select the field monitoring sites for this project? Were they chosen for the use of particular farming practices or other reasons?
They were chosen by farmers themselves, actually. So this is how our project is also farmer-led research as well, because we are very keen to involve farmers in our experimental design as much as we can. And actually, it proved to be very difficult for us to we guided their choices, but we didn't have much flexibility on that. It was mostly them choosing these sites based on, there's a little bit of bias here, because I think they have chosen these based on how they think they will be able to implement changes in practices. So if they have reduced farming problems in one block of land, then I have chosen that one in priority, just because it would be easier to implement changes.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Coline. Please do keep typing questions for Coline into the chat for her to answer. And in the meantime, our next speaker is Andrew Bladon from the Conservation Science Group at the Department of Zoology. And Andrew's talk is Testing Reserve Scale Mitigation for Invertebrates in a Changing Climate. So yeah, please, you can get started, Andrew.
Great, thank you. Can you see my screen okay?
That looks good.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. So my name is Andrew Bladon, and I'm going to talk to you today about give you a bit of an overview of some work that I've been doing for the last 3 years or so within zoology, which actually kind of covers 3 projects, but are all kind of interlinked. So as I'm sure people are aware, many species are already showing responses to climate change, and I think those sort of species level responses can be broken down into 3 broad types. So the first is adaptation. So if species are able to cope with changes in temperature in the location where they're currently found, they begin to adapt to that, and they can persist within their their existing distribution, their existing range. A lot of the time species aren't fully able to adapt, but they are able to move. And so a second response is that we start to see shifts of species distributions across landscapes. And this, there's good evidence for this, particularly in temperate regions, particularly across Europe, of species shifting northwards to track their preferred climate through space. But if species are unable to do either of these things, then they're already beginning to suffer population declines. And this is obviously the group of species that we're potentially most concerned about from a conservation perspective. But these sort of population level responses to climate change, which are often the things that are the sort of best studied and the best modeled, are actually mediated by individual level responses to temperature. So what drives these population level responses is how individuals adapt or don't adapt and change their behavior to local scale temperature changes. And those could be quite small. So that's all about how species persist and use the landscape around them. And we're used to thinking of a landscape, a nature reserve, for example, in terms of the habitat that it provides. But across a landscape, you also get microclimates. And these are areas where the temperature, the humidity, the wind speed are decoupled from the sort of ambient temperature that would be measured by a standard weather station. Standard weather stations, for very good reason, record their conditions in controlled setups, so tend to be 1.5 meters off the ground, shaded in the middle of a field. And that's so that we can compare differences between locations. But that doesn't really reflect the environment that most animals are exposed to. And so changes in topography, changes in vegetation, and changes in shelter can all feed into creating patterns of temperature difference and humidity difference across the landscape. And you can see this in the image on the right, which is an alpine hillside. And you can see the areas of red on the lower image are warmer areas, green and blue are cooler areas. And you can see that there are little pockets associated with lumps and bumps in the landscape. And we know from some work that was done a few years ago that landscapes which have more diverse microclimates are able to retain more species over time than landscapes with less diverse microclimates. So this sort of heterogeneity is known to be good for biodiversity at a population scale. But the question I'm going to ask today and talk a bit about as a specific example is how do butterflies use these landscapes, and can we do anything to improve the landscapes of butterflies in the face of climate change? So this was a project that I started 3 years ago, where we started to think about how butterflies thermoregulate and how they might go about using those microclimates within the landscape. And we thought there were sort of two broad options for how a butterfly might alter its body temperature, given that it's living in a landscape with a particular air temperature. And the first is that it might want to try and find a favorable microclimate. So if you have an air temperature, a standard sort of waist-high air temperature that isn't suitable for a butterfly, it can try and find a perch which is more suitable. So if you measure we went out and caught butterflies, and if you catch a butterfly and you take a temperature from the perch where it's sat and an air temperature, this gives you a measure of the amount of temperature buffering that the butterfly is achieving simply by choosing a more suitable microclimate within the landscape. A second option that a butterfly then has for trying to alter its temperature further is some other form of behavioral thermoregulation. So this might be by trying to increase its temperature by basking, for example, with the wings open, or by trying to cool down with its wings closed, orienting its wings towards the sun in order to heat up, or away from the sun in order to cool down. And the measure, and so butterflies might be able to do this and change their temperature beyond that which is provided simply by their chosen microclimate, their chosen perch. And so in order to look at this, we took the thoracic temperature from individual butterflies and then subtracted from it the perch temperature of the location that they were using. And so we have these two different measures taken from 3 different temperature variables of how butterflies are adapting their body temperature to respond to changes in local air temperature. And what I'm going to show you now is so we collected data on this for 480 butterflies, 16 different species. And what I'm going to show you now is a plot averaged across each species of the behavioral thermoregulation on the y-axis and the microclimate selection on the x-axis. And what you can see when I populate this with data is that there's quite a range of species responses. And you'll notice that all species are above the dotted line, which is the one-to-one relationship. But essentially, the species which fall closest to the dotted line are species which are more heavily reliant on microclimate selection in order to alter their body temperature, because they're not doing very much in terms of behavioral thermoregulation above and beyond what their microclimate is providing. So these species have to select favorable microclimates. And they're exemplified by the small heath, which is the point highlighted here. The colors are simply the different butterfly families. So in this case, I'm going to talk about 2 Nymphalidae because it just helps us to control for impacts of families and stuff. So other species are able to warm themselves behaviorally and are less reliant upon their favorable, the microclimates in the landscape. And these are exemplified by the comma that I've highlighted here, which is much further from the dotted line. And so we thought this kind of gives us a spectrum across which you could define butterflies as either thermal generalists, species which are not dependent on the temperature provided by the landscape, and thermal specialists, which are very dependent on the temperature provided by their landscape. So what we then did was we looked across this spectrum and said, well, is this telling us anything about how species are responding to climate change? So on this figure, we're going to plot the difference between behavioral thermoregulation and microclimate selection on the x-axis. And what that means is that the higher numbers on the right are the thermal generalists, like the comma, and the lower numbers on the left are the thermal specialists, like the small heath. And on the y-axis, I've got the 40-year population trend for each species taken from the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme. And what you can see when I put the data on is that the species on the left, the thermal specialists, tend to have population declines, whereas over on the right, you've got species that are doing a bit better. And again, the lines, the colors and the lines divide up by family, which was important in the model. But what this shows is that the species, the thermal specialists, which are more reliant on microclimates for altering their body temperature, have suffered the most severe population declines in the last 40 years. Just to highlight that, again, with the same species, the small heath is down here and the comma is up here. So this means that we can already detect this effect of climate change, matching a field-based measure of butterflies' individual responses to temperature. We can detect an effect of climate change at the population level. But what does this mean in terms of how we go about conserving these species? Well, I think it means that we have a new sort of focus. So we're used to thinking in terms of conservation, particularly in the UK. Butterflies are divided into habitat specialists and habitat generalists based on their requirement for food plants or habitat associations. And we're used to conserving those specialists. But what we now need to start thinking about is how we can go about conserving the thermal specialists, because I should note that the species shown on this figure are primarily all habitat generalists. So these are species which are traditionally thought of as being less concern for conservation because they have quite generalist habitat requirements. So how do we go about managing our nature reserves for the conservation of thermal specialist species? As I say, we're used to doing this for habitat requirements. Well, another project that I'm involved with, which is what I've been working on for the last couple of years, is the Conservation Evidence Project, which aims to summarise evidence for conservation actions for all taxonomic groups. And in particular, what I've been working on for that is a synopsis of evidence for butterfly and moth conservation. And interestingly, this project, sort of independently of the work that I've already presented to you, has found that we've got globally, there are currently no tests of actions to mitigate the impacts of climate change on butterflies and moths. So although that climate change is sort of an emerging threat for conservation, there's nothing known about how we can actually start to mitigate these impacts at a kind of individual, a local reserve level, which is the sort of scale at which reserve managers are going to work. And this is where our third project comes in, which is one which is just in its infancy, which is we've called Banking on Butterflies, because butterflies are the focus. And what we're really testing here is whether increasing topographic diversity can benefit butterflies and other invertebrates at a reserve scale on local landscapes. So to do this, we're working with the local wildlife trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire on 2 of their reserves in Bedfordshire. So this is the Tottenham Reserve on the left and Pegston Hills on the right. And within these, the reserve outlines are shown in blue, and then within these red areas, which are currently quite flat, we're setting up this before-after controlled intervention ecological experiment, where we're building E-shaped banks. There's a plan of one in the top right, and these E-shaped banks are designed to give us a fully replicated design of north, south, east and west facing slopes, areas of shelter, and also areas of that are exposed, areas where the topography has been manipulated and areas where it hasn't been manipulated, and then some full controls where we've not manipulated either the topography or the habitat. And what we're doing with this project is a whole host of things to see how these banks change the landscape. So we've taken temperature recordings from each of the points highlighted on the diagram. We're doing vegetation surveys across the banks, butterfly surveys, caterpillar searches, and we've also placed out pitfall traps, again at each of the sample locations, where we can look at some other taxonomic groups. So ants, beetles and spiders are a particular focus. So this summer was spent on this project collecting the baseline data before we put the banks in. So out in the fields, marked out the plots, which is the figure you can see here, before we actually did anything, to see what was going on beforehand. And then in September, just gone, these banks were built. And as you can see at the moment, they look quite bare because they've been put together by a digger. But what we're planning to do in the next few years is to then see how these banks develop and what impact they have on the species communities that are living in these previously quite flat environments. So just to summarize, understanding individual responses to temperature is crucial for predicting how species are likely to respond to climate change. The thermoregulatory strategies of butterflies differ across the community, and we've identified a group of thermal specialists which are at greater risk from climate change because they're more reliant on finding suitable microclimates within a landscape. And in order to try and kind of combat this and advance conservation, we're beginning to try and test mitigation strategies to help biodiversity persist in the face of climate change. And there's a website for the project, which I've just put down at the bottom. So I'd just like to finish by thanking the various funders and research partners for the different projects. In particular, I should acknowledge our PhD student, Esme Ash-Jepson, and Ryan Clark from the Wildlife Trust, who've done most of the data collection for the before study. And thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks so much, Andrew. I really enjoyed that talk. As you can see from I'm fangirling in the comments in the in the chat box. So, can I just ask what the first of my hundreds of questions that I've put in there? How are you measuring the temperature? Are you just using a normal thermometer that's readily available, or have you got a modified kit?
So it's a specialist piece of kit, not specialist particularly for taking temperatures of butterflies, but for taking fine temperature readings. So it's a 1/4 millimeter thick thermocouple on the end of a wire, and that allows you to sort of poke it. If you catch a butterfly, you can poke it through the net and just touch it on the thorax of the butterfly to take its body temperature, and then use the same thing to take the temperature of the flower that it was using.
Okay, brilliant. We've got a question from Eric. Do you think these banks you present could provide the required conditions for a reserve for thermal specialists in a warming climate? Will they provide the right microclimates, and will it be easy to implement these banks in existing nature reserves if they prove to be effective? Yeah,
so we're testing whether they'll create this environment. So that's why we've got the temperature loggers out across the banks to see what difference it makes. But we know other studies that have looked at existing microclimates in landscapes have shown that, the variation in temperature that you get at a fine scale can be, you can get a 10-degree variation in temperature if you choose the right spot in a landscape. And that's far greater than the sort of rise that we're expecting to see from climate change. So theoretically, it's sort of possible that you should be able to create these refuges. And really what we're hoping to do is to demonstrate whether or not these banks work. But the beauty of the project is that because we've designed it in collaboration with the Wildlife Trust, we know that this is something that's fully implementable on reserves. So we picked areas. The reserves are ones which are quite topographically diverse, but have these flatter areas, which are actually all ex-arable land that's been in arable reversion. And so we've deliberately chosen those areas as sort of targets. And the banks are about £1,000 each to create. So they're, budget-wise, it's within the scope of reserve managers and plans. And actually, the interesting thing is that the more we talk about this project, the more we get people coming up to us and saying, "Oh, I'd be interested in creating some of those." And so I think it's something that's quite sort of tractable and attractive to people. And now we just need the data to see whether or not they work.
Okay, fantastic, Andrew. Yeah, that was a fabulous talk. So the next talk we've got is from Alejandro Guizar Coutiño from the Forest Ecology and Conservation Group in the Department of Plant Sciences. And the title of his talk is REDD+ Works Where It Matters Most. So Alejandro, please go for it.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. There's an echo.
There's an echo over there. Okay.
Yeah.
Sort that over. Hi, everyone. Thanks again. Can you see my screen?
No.
No. Oh, sorry about that. Okay.
If you're using two monitors, you might want to duplicate what is on your screen.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, this was already working before.
Okay, looks good.
Now, okay. Great. Thanks. Sorry for that. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm Alex Guizar. I'm a PhD student in the Forest Ecology Group here at Cambridge. My research is focused on understanding the impacts of interventions for conserving tropical forests. And today, I'm going to share some of the work that I've been doing as part of my PhD. Well, first, we are aware of international commitments to reduce deforestation. These have been on the table of the UNFCCC negotiations for more than a decade now. And moreover, specifically stopping deforestation is a crucial topic being discussed at Glasgow currently. But despite commitments made to date, we're still witnessing tropical deforestation, tropical forests disappear fast. And we know this is quite problematic. Forests regulate climate and other ecosystem services. They are essential for conserving biodiversity, and also a lot of people around the world call these forests home. So given these issues, one way of reducing deforestation and preventing further deforestation from happening is to, beyond protected areas and these traditional approaches, is to try to incentivize people, which would be communities and forest users, to stop deforestation. And in essence, this is what REDD+ this is about. REDD is short for reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And as a concept, it promotes the idea of making forests worth more standing than logged. And the basic premise behind REDD is to incentivize through payments or other means activities that either results in reduced deforestation or results in the expansion of forest cover. Going on the concept of avoided deforestation, this refers to forest loss that could have happened but didn't take place thanks to a targeted intervention. In the context of REDD, these reductions are assessed against a baseline scenario, or in other words, an estimate of the deforestation that could have taken place in the absence of REDD. So I will try to explain this in the graph that I'm showing here. let's say that the vertical gray line over here represents the time at which a RED project became implemented. This solid blue line represents the historical emissions, and this dotted line here represents the expected emissions in the absence of RED. Normally, to assess the impact of RED, we would compare the projected emissions against the observed emissions. This difference, which is called additionality in the jargon, refers to avoided emissions or the benefits of implementing the project. This could be avoided emissions, or if we change the y-axis to forest area, it could also refer to an area of forest that was successfully avoided to being cut down. So now, well, as simple as this may sound, establishing a baseline and setting up a baseline from which to compare these reductions in deforestation can be, it's not that simple, and it can be quite a challenging step in developing these RED projects. So RED has been around for more than a decade, and we are starting to understand how good it has been at preventing deforestation. Recent studies are providing a mixed picture on both the impacts of RED in avoiding deforestation and in improving local livelihoods. So the focus of my analysis is centered on deforestation benefits, and to understand this, we produce a global assessment using a sample of sites from across the tropics and the standardized methodology to assess changes in forest cover. So I'm gonna go very quickly on the methodology. We used sites from the Verified Carbon Standards, which is one of the leading accreditation institutions for voluntary RED projects. And to give you a bit of context, typically what happens is that project developers and landowners or land users form a partnership to implement a set of activities to stop deforestation. And these reductions in deforestation are then verified after a certain period of time by a third-party auditor. To get a measure of forest loss and forest degradation, we use the Tropical Moist Forest Map from the EU Joint Research Center, which was recently released. And it basically, this database is produced based on Landsat imagery, and it tracks deforestation and forest degradation for a period of over 3 decades. Okay, I will give you a bit more details in how I constructed a comparable group to assess impact of RED. First of all, we compare deforestation inside RED project areas, which are the orange polygons here, against similar forested sites within the same country and biome. And given the prevalence of protected areas in the landscape that we examined, we ran a secondary analysis which excluded protected area portions from the comparison groups. Now, the counterfactuals, to get an idea of the impact of RED, it was crucial to establish a reliable counterfactual scenario that would enable us to examine what would have happened had these interventions not taken place. And again, one way of doing this is to find from the pool of observation or from all the data that we collected, a set of observations, uncleared observations that have similar deforestation risks than the one observed in RED. And to do this, or to achieve or to find these similarities, we used a technique called statistical matching. Matching in this context refers to the pairing of observations from different populations that are similar in many characteristics, except on the fact that one is treated and the other one is not. So if you imagine these green polygons to be a RED site, actually they are, and say we want to match a given pixel, the one here, this red dot, we would do that by looking at other pixels outside this polygon exposed to similar deforestation risks in terms of how accessible this site is, how whether the land is productive or not, whether the land is protected or not. And And this is what we did through matching. We ended up matching pixels inside the red polygons with pixels outside, match on elevation, slope, distance to cities, distance to recent forest clearings, and located within the same country and biome. And I'm going to share some of the findings. After matching, we were able to, or after collecting all the data and going through the matching process, we were able to match 40 sites out of 71 that we initially collected. And we couldn't evaluate the impact on the other sites for different reasons. Some of them because they are located in seasonally dry landscapes, and we didn't have enough data for those. Others have been operating over a short period of time, so there wasn't enough observations to compare against. And there were other projects, the ones with the orange dots, that we just couldn't compare. We just couldn't find a comparable group to compare against. Going more into the details of what we found, these two graphs show the reductions in deforestation and degradation rates resulting from REDD projects over the first 5 years of project implementation. The x-axis shows the difference between the treated and control groups. And essentially what we see here is that anything on the left side of this dotted line represents a reduction in deforestation or in degradation in this case. As we can see here, the majority of sites show at least a moderate reduction compared to controls, at least when we look at the simple means. This is the case when we look at deforestation and degradation rates. However, we expected that the impacts of REDD will vary according to the ongoing deforestation at the host countries. So to dig in further, we ran a secondary analysis, dividing our pool of observations or a pool of projects into two groups, a low and high threat category. And I can give more details of that. But essentially this graph, what we see here is that this graph shows the annual difference in deforestation between REDD and their controls. The difference were calculated on an annual basis, and at each year we took the observed rate of deforestation at treated sites and subtracted the rate of the controls. And essentially what the main idea is that anything under or below this horizontal line represents a reduction in deforestation. Any observation above represents that there was actually more deforestation in REDD compared to the controls. So as we can see here, most projects are located in the low threat areas. And in the high threat areas, in the high threat categories, we have projects, we have sites in Madagascar, sites in Cambodia, which had high deforestation rates at the time when these projects became implemented. And one takeaway from this graph is that the effects of reducing deforestation in the high threat category are more consistent than what we can see in the low threat category group, which is less clear. And well, another way of summarizing what I just show is if we collapse these annual observations and estimate the mean and compute the confidence intervals, again, we see that the low threat groups show moderate reductions in deforestation, but there is consistently higher reductions in deforestation in the high threat category. So I'm not sure how much time I have. To wrap up, I just touched on a few aspects of REDD, and there are many challenging aspects, including setting baselines, defining leakage, and currently at the moment, which is very crucial to the negotiations taking place, is the discussions around the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which would help to conform an international carbon market to stabilize the price of carbon. Just to note that on the results, and going back to what I showed in the difference between low and high threat category groups, it's perhaps not surprising to show or to see practically no effects in the low pressure areas. And this is for two reasons. One is maybe there's nothing much to gain if there wasn't many threats going on at the moment. But another point to note here is that many of these sites, at least when we look into the details of each site, many of them had ongoing activities before RED started. So it's also difficult to assign any effect due to RED when you had a treatment ongoing beforehand. And well, if anything, these results show that there is potentially benefits in focusing on sites that are being implemented in high deforestation areas, either now or in the near future. And this is very important because pressures on tropical forests are expected to increase in the near future. And thank you very much.
Thanks very much. That was a fantastic talk. We've got a couple of questions in the chat. One from Eric. Based on your work, do you think the commitments on deforestation made at COP26 last week will prove an effective means to reduce deforestation? And are these pledges enough?
That's a good question. First of all, we are yet to see to what extent they become formalized and implemented, and crucially, yeah, which parties are also sitting at the negotiation table. So there is a potential. There is definitely potential to make these commitments bolder, but the mechanics, and there are many details that are yet to be decided and discussed, and in particular, anything related to the Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, again, that relates to the establishment of a forest of a carbon market. And there was a release of a draft document yesterday, and somewhat worryingly, there's no mention of Article 6 yet.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much again. If we move on to our next speaker, Rogelio Luque Lora from the Department of Geography. And Rogelio's talk is Nature-Based Solutions for Climate, People and Biodiversity, a briefing paper for COP26.
Hi everyone, can you all see my presentation now?
Looks
Great.
good.
Well, thank you all for staying till the final presentation of the afternoon, and thank you to everyone who presented before me for such interesting research. In a bit of a break from the other early career presentations, I'll be presenting not my PhD research, but I'll be presenting on a briefing paper that I coordinated and co-wrote with a bunch of other academics in preparation for COP26. And in this case, the policy briefing was on nature-based solutions, which Adam, I was glad to hear, mentioned in his presentation earlier this afternoon. So this was one of several briefings that were commissioned by the COP26 Universities Network, which is a group of UK-based institutions, including Cambridge Zero. And these policy briefings are being presented to the Cabinet Office. They're very much written for policymakers. They're written by researchers, but they basically summarize the available research on a particular topic related to climate change and how best to optimize policymaking to derive the most benefits out of each of these areas. So you can see that there are a range of other briefings, including, for example, how to transition away from carbon most fairly, or how to recover from COVID-19 in the most climate-friendly way possible. But the purpose of our briefing was to do with nature-based solutions, which Natalie Seddon from the University of Oxford, who's also a co-author on this briefing, and her colleagues define as solutions to societal problems that involve working with nature. The common UK examples include restoring coastal wetlands to mitigate flooding and restoring uplands to reduce soil erosion and regulate downstream water flow. So you can see there's a very clear goal in mind, such as reducing erosion, but then instead of using more traditional kinds of engineering involving concrete and metal, wildlife and domesticated species are used to achieve these goals. And as you can see from the title of our briefing, the idea is to deliver benefits for climate mitigation, but also for biodiversity and also to enhance human well-being. So there's a triple win narrative at play. Here is a full list of the authors on the briefing. And from the very beginning, we tried to strike a good balance between natural scientists and social scientists, so that not only did we try to get the science right from a natural sciences point of view, but also that conservation and environmental decision-making happens by people and it affects people, right? So to make sure that there was the available expertise to know how the proposed interventions will affect the different stakeholders. So now in the rest of my presentation, I'll summarize the key messages of our briefing. And then right at the end, I'll share a couple of personal reflections on the process itself of writing this briefing. So we categorized nature-based solutions, or NBS, into those that seek to protect existing ecosystems. So for example, as Alex was telling us about, protecting existing rainforest from potential threats of deforestation. Then there are those NBS interventions that aim to restore landscapes, for example, restoring woodlands in the uplands in the UK. Then there are those interventions that seek to better manage working landscapes. And I think Coline's presentation on regenerative agriculture was the best fit for this third type of NBS. And then finally, there are those interventions that seek to create novel ecosystems. And perhaps the most famous example of this is urban nature and urban gardens. As I said a minute ago, NBS adopts a triple win narrative for climate change, biodiversity, and human well-being. So for example, restoring woodlands in the UK would aim to mitigate climate change by absorbing CO2, increase biodiversity because native woodlands are more biodiverse typically than heathland. To mitigate flooding and erosion, which would be the societal, one of the societal problems that is being fixed, and then to create recreational spaces for people. So you can see this triple win at play here. But of course, as political ecologists have long argued, there are winners and losers to basically every environmental intervention. So sticking with the same example, we can think of sheep farmers in the UK whose heritage and whose livelihood would be affected by such a drastic change in the land. So I and the other social scientists in the briefing tried to be very clear that even if certain interventions are deployed, one should not neglect those losses and who loses in the process, and therefore to craft and design NBS so that local people and those who would be affected by the interventions are involved at every stage of the process. So after giving an overview of NBS, we then highlighted two of the main caveats that we find with nature-based solutions. And the most important one that we identified is that nature-based solutions should not be an excuse to maintain the status quo. The key task, we think, to averting catastrophic climate change is to rapidly and thoroughly decarbonize the economy. And if that's not done, then planting more trees is not going to work as a long-term solution. And the risk is that corporations or governments could use commitments to NBS to underachieve or to justify underachieving in the decarbonization tasks. And the second main risk that we highlight has to do with the hype that there is currently around planting trees. So Emily mentioned the Trillion Trees campaign, for instance, and particularly we warn against commercial monocultures, which are very undiverse. In fact, they're usually less diverse than the grasslands that they replace, let alone the ancient woodlands that they sometimes replace. And they can also underperform with carbon sequestration goals because if we think about what happens to the forestry products after they are harvested, for example, wood chips being burnt, the CO2 is quickly re-released into the atmosphere. Here's a sign I found in the south of Chile when I was doing my PhD research, with the very frequent slogan saying that plantations are not forests. And then toward the end of the briefing, we offer a set of more specific policy recommendations to both maximize the potential of NBS, but also to avoid those pitfalls that we identified. So thinking about the first risk that I mentioned about the excuse or NBS potentially being used as an excuse for not decarbonizing, we suggest that criteria are put into place to ensure that companies are already doing enough to reduce their emissions before they can claim credits via nature-based solutions. And then in the context of forestry plantations, I think it would be very wise to heed the lessons that we have learned from 10 years of REDD+, some of them mentioned by Alex. We particularly highlight the dangers of REDD and international interventions being used to avoid doing domestic action. So we can think of more developed countries, for example, offsetting their emissions through outsourcing carbon sequestration, and this having the perverse effect that their economies are not decarbonized. So that was the briefing in a nutshell, and I thought it'd be nice to end by sharing a couple of more personal reflections on the process of writing this briefing for policymakers. It was a very different experience to the more usual task of writing academic papers. I'm a human geographer, and human geographers love deconstructing concepts and ideas and discourses. For example, nature, we can see here a couple of books, Ecology Without Nature by Timothy Morton, or the subtitle to Jamie Lawrence, Wildlife in the Anthropocene, Conservation of Nature. And I think these questions are not just intellectually interesting, they play a role in how, as a society, we relate to our own concepts and constructs. But at times I found it was necessary to take off our geography hats and use language that we would not normally use in our own research, such as nature or solutions, without unpacking what the problem is or who proposes certain solutions. So that was quite humbling and quite interesting from a practical point of view. But then, as I hope to have also highlighted, this wasn't a completely either or, black or white thing. We did try to, the social scientists among the group did try to use or insert some political ecology, for example, when we emphasize the need to include people at every stage of the process, or pay particular attention at who bears the costs and who derives the benefits. Right, thank you very much, everyone, for your attention, and I'd be happy to take any questions you may have.
Thank you, Rogelio, for a fantastic talk. I've got a quick question. What do you think are quick wins for the UK to implement nature-based solutions? Is there anything that springs to mind as would be a good, fast, low-hanging fruit for us?
With my, I studied biology as an undergraduate, and with my ecology hat on, I've always thought that the uplands, especially when trying to push for either avoiding deforestation in the international landscape or reforesting certain landscapes, I always thought it was a bit hypocritical not to do that here. So yeah, for me, as an ecologist, that would be my suggestion. But then as a political ecologist, as I also highlighted, I think these questions become quite complex, both in who wins and who loses, but also in who gets to decide and how these nature-based solutions are crafted.
Okay, what do you think the role is for the public in trying to get these things done? Is because these nature-based solutions are much more complex than just people making a sound about it and then it turning into rules or regulations or implementing different practices. Is there anything that the public can do that's clear and focused?
Yeah, great question. Maybe two things to say to that. I think the first one would be that around many of these issues to do with climate change, people or the public are often encouraged to change their consumer patterns and to behave differently as consumers. And perhaps NBS can be a good place in which people can start acting as citizens and not just consumers. So for example, local campaigning for certain interventions to be carried out in their local areas. And then the second thing that comes to mind is that as well as campaigning for national or international policies to be passed, perhaps at the more local level, people can also get involved with delivering NBS themselves by getting involved in local campaigns.
Okay, and has your paper generated momentum, or do you think there's going to be some outcomes after COP26, or are you not sure about that yet?
Not sure about it yet, and I should say I'm a bit of an imposter in that I barely heard the word nature-based solutions before I got involved in this. I think Natalie is probably the key expert amongst the authors.
Okay. We have a quick question from Eric. What do you think of the public acceptance of nature-based solutions? For example, with coastal flooding, a managed retreat or wetland restoration NBS solution may be more effective than building concrete sea defences, but some buildings may have to be sacrificed for that approach. How would the public interact with that?
I think great, very thought-provoking question. I think geographers immediately would try to unpack the public and discern the different sectors which might think one way or another. So in the UK, I can imagine that would probably raise conflict or controversy between, say, second home owners who might have a set of aesthetic values in the coastland and therefore appreciate certain nature-based solutions versus local people who rely on those landscapes for their livelihoods.
Okay, yeah, that's a great point. Final question from Tom Swinfield. Who do you think should be responsible for distributing the money paid for NBS should an appropriate amount materialise?
Again, great question. Probably case by case and also type by type, I would say. So if we think about nature-based solutions being delivered by certain corporations as part of their commitments to achieving net zero, probably the most fair and effective way to distribute or allocate funding would be through national institutions, which are democratically accountable. I can then perhaps think that at the more local level, more directly democratic procedures could be put into place where people actively participate in those decisions about how best to allocate funding rather than indirectly via their representatives at the national political landscape level.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks for showing us your paper for COP26, and thanks so much to today's keynote speakers, Emily and Adam, for just absolutely fascinating talks. And thanks to all of the early career presentations. And of course, thank you to the audience for questions too. A huge thank you to the Conservation Research Institute, and in particular, Sasha Khoury for co-hosting this session with Cambridge Zero. I think it was a really absolutely illuminating session. Do join us next week for the Cambridge Zero Symposium on the topic of AI and sustainability if you're interested in that. Okay, thank you very much to everybody.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank you, Lata.
Bye-bye, thank you everybody.
Thanks, bye-bye.